Tonight I'm going to be speaking to you about some research I undertook during my master's program, which assessed methods of incrementally upgrading the existing housing stock in South African informal settlements. In 2010, over 2 million families living in informal settlements were still awaiting permanent brick housing that the government had promised them in 1994. This astounding figure led the government to launch the In-situ Upgrading of Informal Settlement scheme, where one of the primary goals was to upgrade 400,000 housing units by 2014. To date, there has been no visible evidence of this. Traditionally, transitional shelters have been used as part of the humanitarian response to both displaced and non-displaced populations after natural disasters and post-conflict situations, and an incremental approach of how this is achieved is illustrated here. Although the context of the housing crisis in South Africa differs substantially from that of post-disaster or conflict situations, the unacceptable living conditions in South African informal settlements is remarkably similar. Thus, my study looked at whether a similar incremental upgrading approach could be adopted by the South African government. Therefore, these in-situ upgraded houses can be referred to as transitional, based on the fact that they are seen as housing structures for families awaiting permanent homes and not as replacements. This image gives a simplified timeline of the past, present, and future housing transitions for families who were forcibly removed and relocated to urban informal settlements during apartheid. One can link this idea back to the Shelter Centre's Transitional Shelter Guidelines by looking at their diagram of the shelter response cycle. Although water and sanitation improvements have been made to most South African informal settlements, the current housing situation would be the equivalent of the 6-month mark in the response cycle, meaning that building materials and funding are required for any further upgrading. To be clear, the aim of in-situ upgrading in this study was not to replace the current structure of housing in the area by providing families with a brand new prototype design. Instead, it was seen as a means of incrementally incorporating construction techniques and materials into the existing building aesthetic. This approach was chosen based on a literature study that indicated that the results of the classical eviction, destruction, and rebuilding strategy used in several Indian slums were unsatisfactory, as the sense of community experience in slum neighborhoods is lost in the process of relocating families, and homeowners often cannot afford to maintain their new tenements. A much more successful approach of slum upgrading was achieved in a slum in Ho Chi Minh City, where slum dwellers were instead given subsidies to fund their own incremental upgrades that they could make to their homes. With this in mind, the key aims of my research were to select potential incremental upgrades that were applicable to the South African climate and context, and then evaluate them based on how well they met the social, economic, and environmental needs of the end users. And based on these findings, recommendations could be made to the Human Settlements Department that were orchestrating the scheme. Although there are over 2,500 informal settlements in South Africa, I chose to focus on one case study, which is Khayelitsha, which is one of the biggest informal settlements in South Africa. The image on the screen shows the types of materials and construction used in a typical shelter or shack. Based on this design, a standard Khayelitsha shack was modeled using integrated environmental software known as IES to determine the annual interior temperature ranges within the shack. And it's clear that for a large portion of the year, the interior temperature did not fall within the technically comfortable range of 16 to 32 degrees. So based on this analysis, in conjunction with information gathered from previous surveys and site visits in Khayelitsha, it was determined that the major housing issues facing residents were unbearable indoor temperatures, heavy flooding, and the high risk of fire spreading. And then based on these factors, as well as a literature study that reviewed local and global transitional housing designs, as well as discussions with South African engineers, architects, and housing NGOs, the following upgrading strategies were defined: elevating, insulating, ventilating, and shading the structure. Various options that could be used to achieve these strategies were then selected, evaluated, and prioritized using the multi-criteria decision analysis tool. This type of analysis is useful because it has the ability to incorporate the views of various stakeholders, which was a pivotal part of the study, as the views of both the beneficiaries of the scheme, being the Khayelitsha residents, and the orchestrators and funders of the scheme, which was the government, needed to be considered. As you can see, the 4 key criteria were cost, thermal comfort improvement, ease of construction, and material qualities. The recyclability and availability of materials was very important, as the City of Cape Town has developed a sustainability agenda that aims at reducing energy consumption levels substantially by 2014, so that had to be factored in. Results from the analysis are represented in these images, which incorporate the highest prioritized options from each strategy, including isotherm roof insulation, clay insulation in the south-facing wall for passive heating, a roof overhang on the north-facing wall, air vents for stack effect ventilation, and a concrete platform for flooding purposes. The upgraded shack was then modelled in IES to gauge the cumulative benefits of implementing these top prioritized options. Compared to the temperature fluctuations in a baseline shack, which is the red line, the upgraded shack, which is the green line, had much more moderate daily temperature fluctuations, and during peak summer periods there was up to a 6°C temperature reduction. One of the key lessons learned during the study is that to satisfactorily achieve in-situ upgrading housing targets, the government needs to empower the Khayelitsha residents by providing them with various types of support, not only financial, but also skills training and education. The results of the study indicate that any government that is focusing on slum upgrading schemes can and should implement the transitional shelter response strategies that have been employed in post-disaster and conflict situations to provide citizens with more immediate improvements to their current unacceptable living conditions. They simply cannot wait until 2032 for a permanent home. So while the context of slum upgrading and the timelines of their response cycles do differ from post-disaster and conflict situations, the desired result should be the same. That is, a permanent, durable end product for the end users.